So, just to start, we've got the title, Understanding the Landscape of Mental Wellness in Our Children, a webinar for parents. Next slide. So what is mental health? Mental health, from the World Health Organization, mental health is defined as a state of well-being in every individual where realizes his or own potential and can cope with the daily stressors of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So what is really important here to notice is that it's not just the absence of disease. It's not just if you're not anxious or not depressed. Mental health encompasses a much bigger and broader spectrum. It means you can function in your day-to-day life with productivity, with not feeling stressed, with coming back to your family, with being able to cope with the work-life balance, and to surround yourself in a loving environment. So it's really important because when we talk about mental health, we talk about how we are able to go through the journey of life in that way that we can contribute to the society and contribute to our own evolution as well. We know that the mental health affects our cognition, affects our behavior, and affects our emotions. And they all start, as Swami says, in our thoughts. So these thoughts are going to affect everything else we do. And that's why mental health is so important. As you know, as we all know, mental health affects our daily life, our relationships, and there's so much research that mental health affects our physical health. So that is why Swami also gives us so much importance to how our brain is working, how we are mentally happy so that we do not have agitation. And that's so crucial because it affects so much of what we do, our relationship with our children, our relationship with our spouse, how we work in our environment outside in the day-to-day life. So what are the hallmarks of mental wellness? We do know that people who are mentally well or healthy have certain characteristics. They have an ability to enjoy life despite what's going on in the stressors and challenges of daily life. They may have difficulties and challenges, but when there's something to enjoy with their children, when there's something to partake with in their community, they're able to enjoy that. They're able to meet family and friends. They're able to enjoy their own spiritual growth. Resilience. People who are mentally well, mentally healthy, have an ability to bounce back when there's challenges, to bounce back when there's adversity. We know through COVID, many of us have had difficult challenges, had to pick ourselves back up and face the world and face the challenges that have happened, whether it be illness, whether it be job challenges, whether it be challenges with children. So that resilience factor is a crucial piece to mental health and mental wellness. And in our previous webinar, we did talk about what are the characteristics of resiliency, how to develop resiliency, and that is often a big topic that's taught to children these days in the school system. Balance, having the capacity to understand important areas and prioritize things in your life. So if we are always working and we're not paying attention to our spirituality or our family, that is bound to start to create some problems with our mental well-being. Equanimity. Swami always talks about equanimity and the ability to remain calm in the face of adversity. So we are going to have presented triggers to us. Our children are going to have triggers. That's often a very common word that's used these days. I'm feeling triggered. But the ability to remain calm when your emotional buttons are being pushed is really a hallmark of mental wellness. And in fact, Swami says that equanimity is a hallmark of spiritual growth. Flexibility. We all are going to, and we've all had to have flexibility in this last pandemic years. Having the ability to adjust our behaviors, change courses if we need. Some people have had to take new jobs. Some people have had to have a different environment for work, but reframing our expectations and not getting so overwhelmed by the ability, so overwhelmed when we have to change course. So flexibility is very key in mental health. And when we know that people are very rigid and do not have that ability to have flexibility, it creates problems for themselves. And the last one is self-actualization and self-discovery. Who am I? What am I here for? Am I fulfilling my purpose? Am I growing? Am I actually knowing who I am? And this is obviously very important in our SI organization, because Swami always asks us, who are you? Who are you? And really to be able to understand our role on our day-to-day role, living in the world, but also to be able to understand our role as a spiritual growth and being able to start moving towards that. So really being able to connect, reflect, and then understand our world around us and what does it mean to how we are living in the world with our inner purpose. Next slide, please. So as you know, we've all gone through this pandemic roller coaster. We've been tested. All of our, everything that we've known has changed and triggered, and we've had so many stressors in the school environment, in the home environment, with our ability to have physical activities inside or out has changed, social activities. We've not been able to attend community events. Our SI centers have been closed. We've had so much adaptation changes that we've had to have. We've had a lot of fears for ourselves, for our family, and for the future, economically for ourselves, economically for our country. And then there's so many questions about vaccines, and all of us are at the point we're wondering, when will this end? So there's been a lot of emotions and stressors that have come with the pandemic roller coaster. And sometimes, even though we're coping, we actually don't realize that underlying constant stress that happens to us. And when that happens, it tests us. It tests our ability to remain calm, to be able to interact with the world and our children, which is what this webinar is about, interact with our children in the same space that we would have done normally before the pandemic. Next slide, please. So Swami says, you must welcome tests, and this pandemic has been a big test for us. You must welcome tests as it gives you confidence and ensures promotion. And so in relation to this webinar, Swami is also giving us as parents, is giving us tests. So we actually have to embrace those tests that Swami is giving us as parents and really rise to the occasion and see how much can we grow. How much can we evolve in Swami's journey when he talks about understanding who we are and the spiritual connection that we have to have. Swami gives us these tests to go inward and to really see how we can get closer and closer to him and to our divine self. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Sister Patricia, and I hope that this is an engaging and informative panel discussion. Saira.
Thank you, Sister Nishi, for the great introduction, setting the stage for our panelists. So as I mentioned earlier, we took the questions that had been previously submitted and we broke them into 3 themes. The first theme is related to stress, depression, and anxiety. They're words that we throw around fairly easily, sometimes not fully understanding them or wishing that we had never heard of them. So Dr. Badri is going to clear up the confusion for us. He's going to talk a little bit about what each of them mean and some of the things that you can do around them. So over to you, Dr. Badri.
Saram, everyone. Thank you so much, Sister Patricia, for introducing me, and thank you so much, Sister Nishi, for really laying the groundwork so beautifully for this webinar. I'm really grateful to Sister Nishi for inviting me here today to be a part of this distinguished panel. And I'm so heartened really to see how many of you are present at this webinar today, because I think that pediatric or mental health in children is a topic that is really spoken about less than I would wish that it were. And I think there's a stigma around mental health in adults as well as children. And I think that we under-recognize that children experience stress and distress as much as adults do. So again, I'm really excited to be talking about this. I will, at the outset, apologize for maybe some false advertising that I may have done, and that I'm actually a pediatric emergency specialist. So I come from the angle that I usually see pediatric mental health at its time of crisis, when families are in crisis, when children are in crisis. And I hope that none of you ever see me with your child. You don't want to, because we are now at the point where the child and the family are unable to cope. So I'm hoping that with this productive conversation that we are all going to have today, that we are able to take a step back, actually look at how to preserve the hallmarks of wellness that Sister Nishi laid out, and how to prevent a child from going into a place where they're unable to cope with stress. Ultimately, stress is something that we cannot avoid. And one of the main themes of the questions were, how do we differentiate between a healthy amount of stress and pressure, which we all underwent, and which we think contributed to our growth as individuals? So there's seems to be a healthy amount of stress and pressure, and there's a point where that becomes maladaptive and where that becomes unhealthy for the child. So where is that line? How do we recognize it? So stress is something that humans evolved with, right? It is our fight or flight system. It is what in primitive times alerted us to danger, to that saber-toothed tiger. So it is protective. And in modern times, it is a fuel for performance. It helps the child to be safe. It helps the child to succeed. But there comes a time where stress becomes distress. Either the amount of stress can become too excessive for the child to be able to cope. The amount of exposure, the duration of exposure becomes too long, and a child becomes exposed to chronic stress. That changes the very genetics of a child, and that increases their risk for chronic health problems such as heart disease and diabetes. So how we want to recognize stress early when we see it in a child. And let me tell you, as we all know, that children unfortunately do not come with signs saying, I am stressed, or I am anxious, or I am depressed. And so we ultimately have to be Sherlock Holmes. We have to be investigators and look for the subtle clues and hints that children give us to indicate that they're unable to cope. So what can these signs look like? It could start off with, in young children, a regression to earlier behavioral patterns. A child may do something as simple as sucking their thumb again, being afraid to be alone in their room, so crawling into their parents' bed. A child may be acting out more, crying more, having more tantrums, become more irritable. There may be actual physical symptoms. You may see children now suddenly complaining of stomach aches, headaches, muscle pains. In older kids, you may start seeing symptoms such as social withdrawal. They're more locked in their room. They're on the screens more. They don't want to go to school. So you see the slow evolution. It can be very subtle as first, but before you know it, you see that your child is different from how you remember. So I think that the important thing at this point is to develop a routine where you have a safe environment for your child to be able to communicate to you what is going on with them. And so this should be something that is judgment-free. There shouldn't be defensiveness in terms of the parent thinking that it's something that they caused. And there shouldn't be judgment that the child is somehow inadequate or insufficient or too weak in order to be able to handle stress. In fact, to be a child is very stressful, and we've somehow forgotten that. There's so many things that are new to learn, to go to school, to form peer relationships, small changes in their schedules. All of this can have the potential to be overwhelming. So we need to have this welcoming environment for children so that we are able to check in with them and ask them if something is wrong with them. I always feel that when we're trying to recognize what is happening to a child, it is important to connect before attempting to correct. And so this could be as simple as having a dedicated time of day where we're just asking the child, how are you? Is there something today that made you happy? Is there something that happened today that made you worried? Is there something that happened today that made you sad? And these conversations don't have to happen face to face, as I find that those can often be awkward and scary for a child, but it can be in a moment of connection. When you're going out for a walk with your child, when you're driving your child home from school, when you're cuddling with your child at bedtime, or when you're reading a book to your child. This is an ample time, or of course, during family meal times is another great example. This is a great time to just ask a simple, non-threatening questions, just as a routine. Something doesn't have to be going on, but you can start that ritual, that process of engaging with your child and talking about mental health. So when does stress become distress? Two of the most common things that are manifested in a child's distress are anxiety and depression. And these are two common mental health disorders that I want to say have not been driven by the pandemic, but have been exacerbated by the pandemic. There's now a lot of literature in the scientific community that has shown a very significant increase from the early 2000s and over all the years since, showing a significant increase in anxiety and depression in children. The reasons for this are multifactorial, of course. We may be just more knowledgeable of these conditions now and recognizing them more in children. Social media may be amplifying these. Children are also more susceptible now to what they see on screens and are exposed to in technology. So there are lots of reasons why, but I think that there is evidence to show that these concerns are becoming more prevalent, irrespective of income, ethnicity, or where you come from. So I think that it's really important to recognize the symptoms of anxiety and depression. And like I said, in children, it's very subtle and can be hard to tease out. Most of the symptoms of anxiety and depression are similar to what we've talked about before. So in anxiety, you have now a child who's slowly become afraid to be apart from their parent. So this is separation anxiety, to go to school or to go to another person's house to see their friend. This is social anxiety. You may start seeing development of obsessive compulsive rituals, or you may start seeing in youth anxiety around eating or gaining weight. And this is a epidemic of eating disorders that some of you may be aware is especially increased during the pandemic. Depression is usually distinguished from anxiety in that anxiety is primarily the child is worried about things. In depression, the child is sad. And so this can be manifested in a child having difficulty concentrating, having low energy, sleeping more or sometimes sleeping less, not wanting to go to school or being with their friends anymore, eating less. So these are some subtle signs of a depression as well. There are lots of things that I think we can do practically to help a child cope with stress, anxiety, and depression. And I'll open this up now to the rest of my panelists so we can talk about some of the strategies that we recommend to families.
Before we move on to strategies, Badri, I wanted to speak to your point of where you talked about that there's no one marker that says, you know, a child may develop that, you know, the ethnicity, the parentage, being a Sai devotee, or coming from any sort of background, financial or otherwise. I think that's very important for parents. And that's one big take-home message that we wanted to reiterate today from our panel, is not to have that simplistic thought that it cannot happen to me. So it would be very wise for parents of children of any age to keep that mind open. And again, a lot of the symptoms and signs that you talked about are very prevalent in teenage. So it's hard for parents sometimes to differentiate the two. Is this a teenage issue, a hormone-related issue, or is this something deeper that I need to worry about? And my recommendation would be is to reach out to somebody who can help, rather than try to sort this out on your own. Multiple resources such as, you know, your family doctor, your pediatrician, a social worker, teachers, anybody that can help in that regard without having to fix this by ourselves. That is a big take-home message we wanted to provide today, is for people not to be in denial that it cannot happen to them.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think that it's important, that point you made, that parents are not alone, and that it takes a village to raise a child, and that there is a huge wealth of resources that a parent can avail of, even just to find out more about their child. And I think a guru or a teacher is an excellent person. A friend of an older child would be another person to, you know, ask as well. We don't have to put the pressure just on that interaction between the parent and the child to find out what's going on. So yes, I absolutely agree.
Sister Nishi.
Badri, I was picking up on the point that you talked about, that saying that, you know, when you're talking to your children, or you recognize that something's happening, not to feel that it's, you know, your fault, or not to get defensive, because many parents live with guilt that, oh, something's wrong with my child, or what did I do? But to recognize that, you know, the children that are growing up in today's world are growing up in a different world than we grew up in, and a different world than their grandparents grew up in. So I think it's really important to be aware that, you know, sometimes we also say that, you know, we did it, or we had stressors, we went through it. It's a very common theme, particularly in Asian cultures, is that, you know, you should be able to handle the stress. We all went through it. And to some extent, as you said, you know, some stress is good. It pushes us to do well. It pushes us to be productive. But when there's that chronic stress of the environment that children are facing today, and we don't even actually recognize, as you said, the stresses that they have, you know, the whole social world, social media, the internet, the constant bombardment of messages that they are receiving of who they should be, where they should be, what they should be, and how they should be, is actually a chronic stress for them. And so what I find is sometimes parents don't realize that the coping mechanisms that we had perhaps as children growing up, the children of today don't necessarily have those built in. For example, you know, we weren't stuck with computer technology. We were outside playing with exercise much more often. We had a lot of extended family around often, where there's another ability to bounce things off and let the stressors go. There was not a constant comparison to the whole world. You only had your own local little group to compare yourself against, not the entire world. So there's so many things that have changed in today's children's environment that creates a chronic low-grade stress on them that we have to be open that their world is different than ours, and to recognize that when they're presented with these chronic stressors, we have to be able to give them a loving environment, or an environment to cope, and to maybe reflect on, okay, we know that some of these stressors are not in our control because they're an outside influence. How are we going to make our inside influence in our home, in our family, a place of sanctity, a place of where they are not stressed, and a place of where we can actually teach them some coping skills, such as meditation, such as playing outside with them rather than just expecting them to play, or giving, doing bhajans, playing music, letting them do art, letting them have a break from their studies so that they're off the computer and go to a different world, right? So just to emphasize that difference of growing up in two generations.
Thank you, Sister Nishi, and thank you, Brother Badri, for a great outline on what these terms mean and some of the things that we can do about them. It's a very nice lead into the second theme. And that theme relates to how we connect with our children, particularly in a multicultural world, and where different values are constantly in play. And Dr. Nitya is going to speak on this.
Before I do that, I think Abby had a point to add to what Nishi was saying.
Yes, thank you, Sister Nitya. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think it's also important to recognize that often mental health illnesses have an organic basis to them. And I've seen a lot of parents coming in and, we wouldn't treat diabetes, for example, by telling our child to push through it, or we wouldn't treat a broken bone by telling our child to toughen up. We would seek medical input and advice on treating those conditions because they're more organic. But when it comes to mental health, I've seen a lot of parents, as Badri and others have said, urge their children to push through it. And I would encourage parents to recognize that sometimes there are, mental health illnesses like bipolar disorder, psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, that simply can't be treated by just pushing through it, right? It does require at times medications and things like that, which you would require sort of input and advice from a family doctor or a doctor in the community. So coming back to what the other panelists have said, if there is any concern of that your child is struggling, don't hesitate to reach out to a medical professional that can help you with identifying what the problem is and the best way to approach that.
All right, I will move on to what was requested of me. Salam, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join us on a busy Sunday. Thank you, Badri, for that excellent presentation where you set the stage for mental illness. Listening to you, you've said most of what I was thinking anyways. I was just thinking I'll close this and go to lunch, but I'm sure I can't do that. So I'm going to, and thank you for all your questions. A big theme that stood out was about cultural values, and people had asked about how do we connect the cultural values that we have grown up with and what our children are now exposed to here, and how are we going to balance that, use Swami's teachings and keep mental wellness, as Sister Nishi so nicely outlined in the beginning. So I want to, and here I'm going to say that whatever I am saying is the pearls of wisdom are culled from my years of experience of talking to so many parents and children in my practice. And first of all, I wanted to start out with saying what the great things about our culture is. When I say our culture, I'm going to say South Asian here because that is what I am a part of. But if there's anyone in here listening in that is not from a South Asian culture, you might want to look back to your own culture to see what good things you bring from that. And from the South Asian culture, the advantages obviously are of family. We're very family oriented, we are very community oriented. We are very grateful that for the most part, everybody is united by a belief in some sort of divinity, a higher power about us. And I don't need to speak to the benefits of the Sai culture, where, you know, Bhagwan has given us pretty much recipes for every little thing, you know, how to be a good wife, how to be a good child, how to be a good doctor, how to be a good parent. Everything Bhagwan has given us. So we're all lucky that we are united in the good things that this culture brings to us. But of course, the flip side to anything is that there are some disadvantages as well. And we find that there's too many people in everyone's lives. Children are constantly not being afforded sometimes the privacy that they need, because there's so many people involved in their lives. There's hardly time for them to say, bring out their feelings, or without a number of people giving opinions based on their own experience or their preconceived notions and things like that, that it is. Again, remember, I'm speaking from experience when patients' children come to me to say that it's hard to communicate because there's just too much happening, around them, where many people are involved. We, in the culture, we have very high expectations. Children have very high expectations of themselves. Parents have very high expectations of their own children, career-wise, behavior-wise, culture-wise, how they should behave. Ultimately, we're all united in one thing, is that we want the best for our children. We all immigrate from far away, wherever we are coming from, and we try to settle down. And many times, new immigrant parents go through a lot of settlement, a lot of adjustments, sacrifices, and, you know, it comes at the cost of career, money, you name it, health, whatever. But children ramp up really quickly. They put in school, and then they are allowed to imbibe the local cultures so quickly. So there's that disconnect. The parents are still adjusting, sacrificing, trying to make a good life for themselves and their children, and children are already ramping up. And so what's happening here? What can we do as parents is, as Badri and Nishi pointed out, is very important to keep. It is very important to keep an open mind. What happens with parents, the pitfall is that we assume that our experience is what it is. Think about it. We don't dress, eat, listen to the same music, watch the same movies as our parents or grandparents. So how is it that parenting styles that were adopted by them are still okay for us? Everybody needs to stop and think and see, is that going to work for me when all of the other aspects of our life are now different? Why would the parenting style then work for me? So you might want to adapt to what's happening, understand what's happening with your children in a completely new place, and give them a safe and open space to talk about, which means, and it's my experience that age is not a prerequisite for wisdom. You listen to our children, they can give us lots and lots of pearls sometimes to learn from. And I know as parents, everybody's experience is that. So listen, see what they have to say, and see what they need rather than pushing our preconceived notions onto them. And many parents, I find, somewhat of a double standard. I'm sorry to say that if I offend anybody, is we want to come away, we want to come far away, give our children a better life, but we want them to be observing the values that we thought we had in India. How is that possible? That's not going to happen. So it's important to remember that, and also that we are, as Nishi in a discussion pointed out, that we seem to stand still in time. We're forgetting that India has moved on too. Cultural values in India are not the same as what we might have grown up with as parents. So and from a practical sense, of course, the most important thing I believe is giving your child the time, understanding that your own cultural and background and beliefs may not hold valid. So listen to them and see what they really want done. And also to see if there can be some kind of common ground. But most importantly, I believe, is parents have to be role models themselves. You've got to walk the talk if you want your children to behave the way you want to and be happy, well-adjusted individuals. I won't even speak to anxiety and depression, which are all, as Abby pointed out, pathological conditions that need treatment. But I'm talking about just general stress and how to connect with your children. We keep talking to them, and it would be very simplistic to think that, yes, we've given them the values and they need to follow it. Taking them to to maybe Bal Vikas or exposing them to the Sai culture. We've done our job. But we need to stop and see whether we are role modeling that ourselves. Children do not want to be lectured to, but they will watch how parents are behaving and learn from them. And that is really important to know. I want to bring here an example in my own family of good parenting skills, and that would be my husband. He, when something happens, when something dire happens in our family, and I will give you an example, is that we were traveling abroad, and due to my carelessness, we lost all our passports to a pickpocket. My husband immediately springs into action and does what needs to be done without any name calling. He doesn't say, oh, you know, we should have done this. You should, no blaming, no nothing. He just steps on to the other one. And I think my children learned early on that that's a very good trait to practice because it's practical. The person who did the mistake is feeling terrible already, so there's no point in beating up on them. And this sets the stage for some very solid, responsible behavior. You know, it's how they would behave. So just as an example, I said, you know, children learn from how we behave and do that. I know this the SAI organization offers the dynamic value parenting seminar, which would be a very good thing for parents to take. And also, again, I cannot stress enough how the role modeling is very, very important. Not assuming that the values that we grew up with is what they are growing up with. The one last point that I wanted to drive home is for parents and any other caregivers, grandparents particularly, to be on the same page when dealing with a child. Very often we find in practice that efforts by one parent is sabotaged by the other or by other caregivers. And I'm sure Avi and Badri will agree with that, is that they are in denial. They do not want to follow through on those recommendations, and it's ultimately the child that suffers. So it's very important for parents to be on the same page when it comes to dealing with their children. And I'll be happy if any of my co-presenters have something to add here.
Nishi, Badri, Avi, anything to add? Nishi.
Hi, Sister Nithya. Thank you for that wonderful dialogue. I think you've hit some really key points that are so important for us to think about. You know, it's very easy, as you said, for us to tell our kids not to be on the phone, or, you know, that not to get angry, not to shout, speak respectfully. But they're, as you said, they're watching us. So when we get stressed, when we're faced with a challenge at work or even from our kids, how are we reacting? Are we name calling? Are we blaming? Are we getting, you know, are getting angry? Are we raising our voice? You know, what is the way we deal with challenges? What is the way we deal with stress? You know, if we're asking our children to meditate, are we meditating? If we're asking our children to do certain things, Swami says, right, point fingers to yourself first before you point fingers to others. And so Swami talks so much about being a role model that we have to really put the mirror up. And I think that's the number one key. So many times, you know, when I see people and they're talking about their kids and they're talking about the phone, but you see that they're looking at their WhatsApp, they're looking at the things at dinner time when everybody's supposed to be together. So it really, behooves us to look at us as a role model. How are we teaching our children coping mechanisms? And of course, we might be doing it right. We can't expect them to follow everything, but the first thing starts with a role model. And then the second piece is that I wanted to say to you is that, you know, again, listening to them, one of the things that I find is that in the South Asian culture, sometimes we're not open with praise. And so sometimes when children are coming home, you know, we're just, you know, what's your homework, what's happening, what has to be done. We're very productive oriented. We need, as in we presented in our last webinar, sometimes we just need to let them come in when they come home from school, just give them a warm hug, say hello, how was your day? Or just, sit and have a cup of tea with them or something. Just create a safe and calm environment. So if they're coming home from a fight and flight stress response and they have an ability to get a calmness, so then you can open the conversation. If we come in and they're upset because of their world, and then we get upset because they're rude, then we're creating this whole stress response because we're reacting to their stress. So that doesn't show them a good way of coping. And I think that's really important. Teenagers, especially, my son always used to say to me, even if I didn't say anything, he said, Mom, I can pick up on your energy. If you're upset or if you're angry or frustrated, I can pick up on that. And they won't talk to us at that time, right? So we have to really look inward and say, where are we at? Are we centered? And are we ready to receive? And I think one of the things that you talked about is really, we must really be open to listen to our children. And I think it's very, very hard. Sometimes children say to us things that we don't want to hear, that we have a hard time accepting. But if children feel heard first, in my experience, and in my experience with patients as well, if people feel heard, if children feel heard, that they're allowed to express, after some time, they will be much more receptive to hear what you have to say, because they feel that they've been understood. And we see this with patients all the time. Patients come in with an agenda, and if you listen to them and you hear them, then they'll be ready to hear what you need to say to them. So I think that's so important with children, especially teenage children, that we can't lecture them, as you mentioned. We have to be able to be present to listen.
I realized when I talked about expectations, I didn't really expand very much on that. But of course, it is very well known that South Asian parents only believe that certain careers are worth having for their children. And that I find in practice is a tremendous amount of stress. Children come through us. They come with their own blueprint as to how they are to evolve towards their ultimate goal in life. And yes, we can make suggestions, we can support them, but insisting on certain career choices, pushing them towards that, places an inordinate amount of stress in children as they are growing up. And we need to recognize that, because some of our children watching other peers are putting a tremendous amount of stress on themselves because they feel they need to measure up to something, keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with what other children are achieving. Children are already experiencing a tremendous amount of pressure, and we do not need to do that. We need to make them understand that every career is valuable as long as they are happy doing something productive that they like. And as all those wellness factors that you mentioned at the beginning, Nishi, if they're checking them all off, then they are in a good place. And we've done our job as parents. And one other point too is what Badri talked about is the stigma around mental health. And the only way we can slowly chip away at that is if we are open to the idea that it could happen to our children, allow them to come to talk to us. The children in my practice that do really well, the first factor that they talk about is not medication, is not their counselor, is not their faith, but their parents. They tell me that their parents have been in their corner all along, and that's the one big thing that's brought them to where out of it. Mental illness is not a sentence for life. People go through various challenges sometimes, and then they get better, like any other chronic disease that Avi talked about. People do get better, and so if we all kept an open mind about what's going on with our children, we will really help them.
Thank you. Dr. Avi.
Yes. I also, Nithyanti, you also mentioned that, one of the hallmarks of South Asian culture is our connection with our culture and with, a higher being and Bhagwan. But one of the also big hallmarks of South Asian culture is having an emphasis on being a doctor, an engineer, or a lawyer. And I think a lot of South Asian parents put a lot of pressure on their children to, study hard, pass your exams, get good grades, so that ultimately you can get a good job and make a good living and be comfortable and enjoy those pleasures of life. But we don't often talk to our children enough about spirituality and the higher meaning of life. our connection with Swami, our connection with God. And I think by, spending some more time discussing these things with our children, it may take some of those other worldly pressures off of them. And that may be how you help them to cope with some of their challenges, because as Nishyanti mentioned earlier, Swami has given us the prescription for life, so to speak, right? And often we just have to follow that to be on the right path. Also, a hallmark that I've noted among my patients, Patricia had mentioned that I worked exclusively with newcomers and refugees for most of my career so far, is that South Asian parents tend to be a little more what I would call paternalistic in the guidance with their children, meaning, creating, making rules, setting certain targets for their children, and applying that sort of pressure on children. Whereas other parenting styles may be a bit more child-centered and working together with the child to reach common goals. And instead of saying, I want you to get a A+ in your math test, it may be a matter of saying, well, how do you want to do in math this year? What's your goal in math? Maybe it's not an A+ for them. Maybe they want to get, a passing grade, right? And working together to have mutually respected and mutually developed goals. And I'll touch a little bit on that in my presentation later on.
Thank you, Dr. Avi. Badri.
I just wanted to emphasize what all my co-panelists have been reiterating, is that I think it's really important, and I developed this just during my training, is that communication with children depends so much on their stage of development. And we need to understand that children at different developmental stages communicate differently and have different ways of thinking about things. So when younger children communicate to us, we have to communicate to them in ways that are concrete. They don't know abstract concepts like sadness or worry or even happiness. But for example, if you relate it to something that does make sense to them, like a favorite toy or TV character, or like my 5-year-old nephew loves Batman. So if you want to have that point of commonality to engage in a conversation with him, I think it's really important to really meet a child where they're at. And then when they get older as well, when they're teens, while they're, now have this growth spurt and they, they're 6 feet and they look like adults, you still have to remember that they're still children, and to talk to them in a way, again, that really is concordant with their development. So again, finding something that is interesting to them. And, when you're a teenager now, it's TikTok or comic books or video games, but really trying to engage with them in something that they're interested in, to get to a point where you can actually talk about what you want to talk about, which is, how they're doing, or you're concerned about their mental health, or your behavior. So different in their on their age and development, and be very cognizant of that.
Thank you, Brother Badri. And thank you, Sister Nitya, for an interesting discussion. As I listened to it, I thought much of what you said and the other panelists could easily apply to communication between adults as well. It's, as Badri says, it's meet people where they're at. On that note, we're going to switch to the third theme. And this theme is focused on the challenges and distractions of technology, both in online learning and as distraction, as well as the feelings of isolation and loss of connection due to measures taken to reduce COVID. And I will turn this over to Dr. Avi.
Thank you, Patricia. I was just thinking about how fitting this topic is for me. You might hear my child in the background crying because my wife just told him that his TV time is up for today. And he was watching TV for a few minutes before and now. So I apologize for any background noise, but it's just so fitting. You know, screens have become, you know, a central part of our children's lives, whether it's through remote learning, um, social media, all sorts of things. And one of the main questions that we got was actually about you know, screen time limits, that, you know, whether it's good, whether it's bad, and how can parents approach this. So I mean, certainly, you know, screen time has its negatives, right? You know, firstly, I'll start off by saying that young children don't learn best from screens. There's a lot of evidence that, oh, sorry about that, that you know, young children between the ages of 24 months and 36 months, you know, more screen time was linked to poorer performances on behavioral, cognitive, and social development tests. Also, you know, researchers have found links between screen time and various mental health challenges with children, particularly when it comes to things like depression, obesity in particular. Um, you know, hearing all of this probably creates a lot of anxiety in parents because, you know, limiting screen time is easier said than done. You know, simply banning screens is basically impossible. Children may need their computers to do homework, remote learning. Um, most psychologists would agree that it's important for children to develop their ability to self-regulate. And parents who micromanage screen time, they may actually inadvertently interfere with that self-regulatory development. So then in that case, how can you limit the screen time for children if we know there are negatives to it? Um, you know, if there's one thing that you can take away from the presentation today, or my presentation, is to develop a family media plan with your family. So, you know, I reviewed the Canadian Pediatric Society as well as the American Academy of Pediatric guidelines on screen time. And both of them are very, you know, certain in recommending developing what's called a family media plan. You know, a family media plan is basically a program. You can find it on the American Academy of Pediatrics website. And I will be sharing that link after I speak, as well as in the, we'll distribute it afterwards by email. But this is a website where you can go through an activity with your children. And together you guys can negotiate, you know, limits and boundaries around screen time usage and create a plan that all parties can agree for appropriate screen usage. You know, studies have shown that this is a more effective approach than setting firm, you know, time limits and creating, you know, rules, so to speak, working with the child so you co-develop your screen time rules may actually be a lot better. Some other strategies to ensure that screens are being appropriately used in your home. So one can consider asking your child or teen to give you their phone at certain times of the day so that they aren't interrupted with phone calls or text messages. You know, try to be present and engaged when screens are used. And if possible, watch and consume media together and talk about the content as opposed to just having the child, you know, watching a video, for example, and not having a discussion and an understanding of what's going on. Also, discouraging media multitasking. I feel multitasking is something that we all do. We're always, you know, having our phone in our pocket, and we're always, you know, responding to every chime that it makes. But especially when it comes to homework time, discouraging using other screens for social purposes during homework is very important. Depending on the age of your child, there are lots of parental control and privacy setting and applications that you can use that can help restrict your child's phone during certain times, and that can help keep those limits in place. Now, it's also important to speak to children and teens about acceptable and unacceptable online behaviors. And I feel like that's not a discussion that parents have enough. It may be a challenging discussion to have in the beginning, but it's something that's very important to keep your children safe online. It's also important to encourage meaningful use of screens as opposed to just screen time in general. We can break screen time down into meaningful and more passive types of consumption. So as parents, we should make sure that daily routines always come first. So things like face-to-face interactions, sleep, and physical activity, those should always take priority over screen time. And they shouldn't, you should not be limiting those things to have screen time. Encourage your child to watch programs that help them learn, such as shows about nature, science, arts, music, or history, as opposed to just shows for entertainment value alone. Be part of your child's media lives. We all have media lives, social media lives. For example, how many of you out there know what Fortnite is or what Minecraft is? But I'm sure a large number of your children are playing those games and so on online. Simply just asking about their experiences and encounters will really help them feel engaged and respond to you a bit better, right? And this was also mentioned by the other panelists before, but model healthy screen use. Your kids are watching you. Review your own media habits. Plan time for hobbies, outdoor activities, family activities. Never text or use headphones when driving or walking or jogging. Try to be in the moment more, and your children will certainly model that. Encourage screen-free time, especially time for family meals and socializing, and turn screens off when they're not in use. So, if there's a TV in the background, turn it off. It doesn't need to be on if no one's actually watching it. And then avoiding screens, at least 1 hour before bedtime is a very useful tip. And keeping screens out of the bedroom. There's been some evidence that suggests that screen use within 1 hour of bedtime actually interferes with melatonin production and actually affects your child's ability to get good quality sleep. There are some recommendations to actually have phones and tablets and laptops charged outside of the bedroom overnight, so that children don't have access to them in their own rooms. Now, how much screen time is too much, right? So you should, as parents, we should also be very aware of signs that screen use is becoming a problem. So if your child is complaining about being bored or unhappy when they don't have access to the technology, oppositional behavior when you set limits on screen time, if the screen time is interfering with sleep, school, or face-to-face interactions, and also if they experience negative emotions after interacting online. Like if your child finishes playing a video game and then you realize that they are expressing some negative emotions, it may be that that's not an experience they should be having. The second part of the question was about engaging in with online or remote learning. It can be very challenging. I've heard numerous patients and parents and children alike complain about how hard remote learning can be during the COVID pandemic. Particularly if you have younger children or children with attention issues. So I think an important part as parents is to understand the expectation for distance learning and be involved with the school. Speak to the teachers, speak to the principal, and understand just how much time they expect children to be spending online. Older students can handle longer periods with remote learning, whereas younger children may not be able to. And for younger children, interaction and play is actually extremely valuable in learning. So get involved and speak to the school. They're very open to speaking to parents, and not enough parents do it enough. It's also important to know what type of activities work best for your child. Are there certain distance learning activities that your child prefers over others? For example, some children may learn best right after breakfast in the morning, and some children learn best in the evenings. There was a case where one child really learned best in the evenings because during the day she had to look after her younger siblings a lot and couldn't really focus much on school during that time. So, figuring out when your child learns best and trying to encourage them to learn when they learn best and how they learn best. Another important point is encouraging movement. Children need to move their bodies throughout the day. We all do. And allow time for exercise before and after your child is having to deal with a distance learning task. Some children are even able to learn better when standing. So standing desks are becoming more and more common these days. Reducing distractions is very important. So when your child is completing their schoolwork, that includes, noise, visual distractions, clutter around their workspace. And as I mentioned before, discouraging multitasking, like no Instagram, no Facebook, no WhatsApp during the learning hours. There are numerous apps, as I mentioned, that we can share afterwards and discuss afterwards that can help with this. And I think it's also important to give your child and yourself a break and understand that, what we're all going through right now is unprecedented, It's a completely new approach to learning, and there will be hiccups along the way, but we should all be very forgiving and understanding these challenges. So, assuming you're able to limit screen time appropriately and, try these strategies, still a lot of parents complain about, or not complain, but, report issues with motivation. How do we get children motivated to learn? They often say they don't want to attend online school. We can foster self-motivation in our kids. And self-motivation, which I kind of touched on earlier, is more important than, authoritative means of motivating children. One of these ways that we could promote self-motivation in our kids is actually by acknowledging their competence previously. So, help your child see where they've done really well in the past, and in ways that were through their own effort, rather than your nagging. And ask, what are some strategies that they used previously when they were successful that can help them, succeed in the future. It may have been something a very long time ago even, but have them explore this and understand why their actions led to success in the past and how they can use those strategies to lead to success going forward. Allowing independence. And I think we need to acknowledge that children need to fail and succeed on their own terms, not because of our involvement as parents. So instead of instructing our kids and planning their day, ask them, what's your plan? Asking kids about their plan makes it clear that they're still in control of their own behavior, and it helps them to keep in touch with their own motivations and intentions. Some kids, if they aren't asked to articulate their plan, they sometimes won't make a plan. Especially kids that have come to know that if they don't make a plan, you're just going to make a plan for them. They're never going to have the motivation to make a plan for their own. So just asking in an open-ended way and allowing them to self-direct their learning plans. The last point, we got a lot of questions about social isolation. This is, leading to the last point of my presentation, but, with less in-person interactions and more remote learning, children may be feeling more socially isolated. And we know that social interaction is an important part of a child's development. By that, I mean learning how to interact with others respectfully, learning social norms, learning how to function as a contributor to society. And one of the ways we do this is by simply interacting with other students at school, teachers, coaches, participating in group activities. With a lot of these activities on hold or taking place virtually, children can miss out on some of this. And it's important for parents to try to encourage these types of activities in a safe way, whether it is virtually through video chats, letters, or if safe, in an outdoor setting with the appropriate use of PPE. Social interaction should be encouraged for these purposes. However, this can also become problematic if children use these mediums to participate in, non-constructive socialization or spend too much time engaged in so-called social media platforms, where they're not really contributing to their social development, but may often be just passively, watching TikTok videos or posting pictures and videos for likes and such behaviors. Overindulgence in these more passive forms of interaction may actually do more harm than good on a child's development. In one of Swami's discourses in the 1977 summer course, Swami addresses his students and he says, by simply uttering unnecessary words and talking too much, you're only causing harm to your own memory and to your own strength. We can certainly talk when it becomes necessary, but it is not necessary to talk and use words when it's not required. Sound is a form of Brahman. Of all the 8 qualities which have been associated with Brahman, the first one is the quality of sound, Sabda Brahman. To some extent, if you undertake to put this into practice and not going on talking unnecessarily, then there will be definite improvement in you. In many ways, the pandemic has given us the opportunity to talk to children about spirituality and, what is the purpose of life? Is it to study, get a good job, earn money, and live a pleasurable life? And if that's the focus that we're pushing on children, then they will think, why should I not do something that increases my pleasure in life now? Like having the most likes on Instagram or the most views on TikTok. I think as parents, we should talk about the spiritual goals of life as well. Swami said in Satya Sai Speaks, volume 35, on the other hand, we do not value that which has to be valued most. The mind is responsible for all this. Hence, we have to purify the mind and focus on divinity. When the mind is focused on divinity, our tejas also increases. Today, man is wasting his energy by entertaining bad thoughts and feelings. To keep bad thoughts in check, one has to develop divine thoughts. So incorporating spiritual practices in the daily schedule of your child will help children to refocus and have a different perspective on life and the pressures that they experience in life. Your children are attending SSSE, so they should get some of this. But as parents, it's also important to not just send your children to SSSE, but also to continue working on their spiritual progress in the home setting on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps do activities together, such as family chanting Suprabhatam in the mornings or bhajans in the evenings. So in summary, encouraging limited form of socialization, be it online or in person, can be beneficial, but over-engaging and being consumed in online mediums may actually be harmful. Take the opportunity to encourage high-quality social interaction and use it as an opportunity to encourage children to learn about spiritual development. So that wraps up my answer to those questions today. I'll open it to any of my other panelists.
Actually, I'm going to take facilitator's prerogative because we're running short of time. Yeah. We have 10 minutes left and we still have a video that we'd like to show. So thank you, Brother Avi, for some wonderful suggestions and ideas. And I think we can all use them not only for our children, but for ourselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Sister Nishi, who's going to introduce the video.
Hi, Ram. Thank you, Badri. Thank you, Sister Nitya and Badri and Avi for a great interactive set. I think we had such wonderful information from everybody. So thank you. And I'm so glad we were all there to make this happen. In looking at mental health and certainly one of the big take homes was that we need to listen and be there for our children, be there for our young children and our adult children, and really have a atmosphere and persona of listening and understanding them and be their support. For children, parents are really everything. Yes, when they grow up, they find that they have a lot more things that they rely on. But as you're growing, your rock are your parents, right? So if children feel that their parents are not able to understand, or not listening, or don't have time to listen, they don't feel that they're worthwhile. And so one of the things that, because mental health presents very differently sometimes in South Asians, there's been a lot of push towards increased awareness and helping the South Asian population with reducing stigma and opening up the conversation. One of those initiatives was the Roshni Project, which was started in Toronto. And they talked to several South Asian young adults and children and came up with a few videos. And we'd like to share one of those with you. The video, it does talks about two different women, or two different young adults, in their experience and their journey with mental health issues and with stress. So Abby, please go ahead. It's always an emotional video. You know, our children need us. Our children, we are the world for them. And I think that sends that message home that, you know, as Sister Nithya said, we can't escape, we don't always escape it. It can happen to any one of us in any spectrum. And really we as adults, as parents, have to really be present and be open and be willing to listen to our children, no matter how much it hurts or it causes us fear or anxiety. We actually have to be able to go through it with them. So I think our time is up, and I'm just going to, Abby, if you can put up my slides, I'm just going to skip through them. I'm not going to talk about them, but maybe just put the last take-home messages. Last slide. We can just skip through and go to the, yeah, there we go. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to reiterate a few things that we've learned today. Really of Sister Nithya, Dr. Badri, Dr. Avi, and everybody talked about some very key points. And really we want to talk about, are we role modeling? What are the messages that we're giving to our young children, to our older children? How do we face adversity in life? Are we showing signs of mental wellness, adaptability, flexibility, equanimity? And if we're not able to do those things, then how can we expect our children to? So really take stock ourselves first. And as Dr. Nithya said, you know, parents have to be on the same page. Otherwise, children are very intelligent. They'll play one parent against the other, right? They have to be a unified front to be able to give the same message to their children, that they're accepted, they're loved, and that they care about them without giving up our own values. Creating a loving and happy environment that's safe for children to talk, so they don't feel judged, so they don't feel anger and resentment from their parents, or that they don't, importantly, that they don't feel that they're always the cause of our misery or our feeling sad, because they take a lot of guilt on. So we really want to have dialogue and creating that happy and loving environment. As it was in the video, is breaking the stigma, really breaking the stigma, opening up the dialogue and creating a safe space. And what I've experienced is listening to them more than talking, because they tune out when they get lectures, but when they are felt heard, when you're listening to them, they see that there's some possible understanding, and they allow themselves to become more vulnerable to talk to you. Having an adaptability, as Dr. Nithya said, to a new country, but still keeping our core values. Swami talks about having an iron fist with a velvet glove, right? That means the core values that Swami talks about, the important values, not the money, not all the other things that we want, but the core values of Swami's 5 human values, Swami's 9-point code of conduct, or whatever is our core values, keeping those with the iron fist. But the velvet glove is how we deliver them, how we bring them into our world with our children, how they experience them. If they feel that they're being told what to do in that authoritarian, constant, difficult relationship, they will not take that home. When they feel it's enveloped in love and gentle guidance, it's much more receptive to receive those values. And keeping true to our values. It doesn't mean that if the children sometimes say things that are contrary to what our core values are, that we agree, but we can have our ground with a velvet glove. And then making sure, as Dr. Nithya said, keeping the supportive aspects of our culture, the belief and the connection with the divine and the higher power, the family support, the feeling that children are so dear to us and we were ready to give everything for them, the support that they get, keep that stuff and let go of the stuff that's really been destructive, the pressures, the judgment, the blame, the lack of any praise, things that are not good for children's psyche and health. So keeping all these minds, we have lots that we can do. We can't combat the external world completely, but we still, the home and the parents and the family is still a huge part of creating that interior world for a child and helping them to grow into happy, resilient, well-adapted children. So I take this time to just say thank you to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Nithya, Dr. Badri, Dr. Avi, everyone, Sister Patricia. Thank you so much for coming together and working together with so that we can present this webinar for the sake of parents in the SCI organization. Sister Usha, would you like to close?
Absolutely. Oh, samastaloka sukhino bhavantu. Samastaloka sukhino bhavantu. Samastaloka sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. जय बोलो भगवान श्री सत्य साई बाबा जी की जय।